Good evening, friends. Back to the YouTube after a long time. In June, after the semester got over, May rather, I was thinking that I should take a little break and go up the hills, freshen up myself, and then again start doing my math, my research, my YouTube. But it seems that those with A positive blood group has an affinity for the COVID-19 virus, and it chased me and got into me for the second time, even though the booster dose was taken. But I am fine now, recovered from COVID and out of quarantine for the last 5 days. I thought that I would start again speaking to my audience. This YouTube channel is about exchanging knowledge, is about discussion about math, is about the joy of knowing nature. There is no other goal behind it. So today, as I start talking to you again, my dear viewers and subscribers, let me start with a story. But a story told in this book called The Road to Reality, which I picked up from a bookshop in Delhi called The Bookworms in B Block in Connaught Place, and which doesn't exist anymore. It's very sad. And it says that it's written by Roger Penrose, the Nobel laureate physicist, Nobel laureate of 2020, and it is written The Road to Reality, the complete guide to the laws of the universe. It starts from the Pythagoras theorem, develops all kind of math you need to know for physics, and it does a lot of physics also, telling you stories about electromagnetism, about relativity, about whatnot, about Big Bang, about particle physics to string theory. So we'll not get into that, but I tell you to read. Don't think that this is a popular science book. To read this book, you yourself need a quite a good understanding of mathematics. But today we are talking. We're going to tell a story which this book starts with. I think the story is essentially made up by Penrose, and there's a story at the end which also I think is made up by Penrose. So book starts with a story and ends with a story. So I'll start with the first story. This brings in how the human spirit is always an inquiring spirit, that it always wants to know about its surroundings, at what's happening around him, why things are happening. So, and that story brings us that spirit. So I will start by reading this story. It may bore you a bit that okay, he's just sitting down and he's reading a story, but let me just do it. Amtep was the king's chief craftsman, an artist of consummate skill. It was night and he lay sleeping on his workshop couch, tired after a handsomely productive evening's work. But his sleep was restless, perhaps from an intangible tension that had seemed to be in the air. Indeed, he was not certain that he was asleep at all when it happened. Daytime had come quite suddenly, when his bones told him that surely it must be still night. He stood up abruptly. Something was odd. The dawn's light could not be in the north, yet the red light shone alarmingly through his broad window that looked out northward over the sea. He moved to the window and started out, incredulous, in amazement. The sun had never before risen in the north. In his dazed state, it took him a few moments to realize that this could not possibly be the sun. It was a distant shaft of deep, fiery red light that beamed vertically upwards from the water into the heavens. You can think what it is. As he stood there, a dark cloud became apparent at the head of the beam, giving the whole structure the appearance of a distant giant parasol, growing, glowing evilly with a smoky flaming staff. The parasol's hood began to spread and darken, a demon from the underworld. The night had been clear, but now the stars disappeared one by one, swallowed up behind this advancing monstrous creature from hell. That is how human being thought. It was a kind of monster. Though the Though terror must have been his natural reaction, he did not move, transfixed for several minutes by the scene's perfect symmetry and awesome beauty. But then the terrible cloud began to bend slightly to the east, caught up by the prevailing winds. Perhaps he gained some comfort from this, and the spell was momentarily broken. But his apprehension at once returned to him, and he seemed to sense a strange disturbance in the ground beneath him, accompanied by ominous sounding rumblings of a nature quite unfamiliar to him. The land was shaking. He began to wonder what it was that could have caused fury. Never before he had witnessed a god's anger of such magnitude. His first reaction was to blame himself for the design on the sacrificial cup that he had just completed. That is how human beings are trained. We are always afraid because we are so frail before these kind of natural calamities that are happening, which in those ancient days were attributed that there was some kind of god or monsters, some kind of monstrous god who was angry with them and was punishing them. Design of the sacrificial cup that he had just completed but worried about it at that time, had the depiction of the bull god not been sufficiently fearsome, had the god been offended, but the absurdity of these thoughts soon struck him. The fury he had just witnessed could not have been the result of such a trivial action. He thought that I am a trivial person, why he should be angry with me? And was surely not aimed at him specifically. But he knew that there would be trouble at the great palace. The priest king would waste no time attempting to appease this demon god. There would be sacrifices. The traditional offering of fruits or even animals would not suffice to pacify an anger of that magnitude. The sacrifice would have to be human. Quite suddenly, and to his utter surprise, he was blown backwards across the room by an impulsive blast of air, followed by a violent wind. The noise was so extreme that he was momentarily deafened. Many of his beautifully adorned pots were whisked away from their shelves and smashed to pieces against the walls behind. As he lay on the floor in a far corner of the room where he had been swept away by the blast, he began to recover his senses and saw that the room was in turmoil. He was horrified to see that one of his favorite great urns had been shattered into small pieces, and the wonderfully detailed designs which he had so carefully crafted reduced to nothing. Amtem rose unsteadily from the floor, and after a while approached the window, this time with considerable trepidation, to re-examine the terrible scene across the sea. Now he thought he saw a disturbance, illuminated by a far-off furnace coming towards him. This appeared to be a vast trough of water. Tsunami. Moving rapidly towards the shore, followed by a cliff-like wall of wave. He again became transfixed, watching the approaching wave began to acquire gigantic proportion. Eventually the disturbance reached the shore, and the sea immediately before him drained away, leaving many ships stranded on the newly formed beach. Then the cliff wave entered the vacated region, struck with a terrible violence. Without exception, the ships were shattered and many nearby houses instantly destroyed. Though the water rose to great heights in the air before him, his own house was spared, because it sat on a high ground a good way from the sea. The great palace too was spared. But Amtem feared the worst might be coming, and he was right, though he knew not how right he was. He did know, however, that no ordinary human sacrifice of a slave could now be sufficient. Something more would be needed to pacify the tempestuous anger of this terrible god. His thoughts turned to his sons and daughters and to his newly born grandson. Even they might not be safe. Amtep had the right to fear new human sacrifices. A young girl and a youth of good birth had been soon apprehended and taken to a nearby temple, high on the slopes of a mountain. The ensuing ritual was well underway when yet another catastrophe struck. The ground shook with devastating violence, and when the temple roof fell in, instantly killing all priests and intended sacrificial victims. As it happened, they would lie there in mid ritual, entombed over 3.5 millennia, and they would be fossilized. The devastation was frightful. Devastation cannot be fruitful. The devastation was frightful but not final. Many on the islands where Amtep and his people lived survived the terrible earthquake, though the great palace was itself completely destroyed. Much of it would be rebuilt over the years. Even the palace would recover much of its original splendor constructed on the ruins of the old. Yet Amtep had vowed to leave the island. His world has now changed irreparably. In the world he knew, there was 1,000 years of peace, prosperity, and culture where the earth goddess had reigned. Wonderful art was allowed to flourish. There was much trade with neighboring lands. The magnificent great palace was a huge, luxurious labyrinth, a virtual city in itself, adorned by superb frescoes of animals and flowers. There was running water, excellent drainage, flushed sewers. War was almost unknown and defenses unnecessary. Now Amtep perceived the earth goddess overthrown by a being with entirely different values. It was some year before Amtep actually left the island, accompanied by his surviving family, on a ship rebuilt by his youngest son, who was a skilled carpenter and a seaman. Amtep's grandson had developed it into an alert child and with an interest in everything around the world. The voyage took some days, but the weather had been supremely calm. One clear night, Amte was explaining to his grandson about the patterns in the star, and then an odd thought overtook him. The patterns of stars had been disturbed not one iota from what they were before the catastrophe of the emergence of the terrible demon. The demon couldn't harm the patterns of the stars. Amtep knew these patterns well, for he had a keen artist's eye. Surely he thought those tiny candles of light in the sky should have been blown at least a little from their position by the violence of that night, just as his pots have been smashed and his great urn shattered. The moon also had kept her face, just as before, and her route across the star-filled heavens had changed not a whit, as far as Amtem could tell. For many moons after the catastrophe, the skies had appeared different. There have been darkness and strange clouds. The moon and the sun sometimes worn unusual colors. You can think why they are so. But this had now passed, and their motion seemed utterly undisturbed. The tiny stars likewise had been quite unmoved. If the heavens had shown such little concern for the catastrophe, having a stature far greater even than that terrible demon, Amtep reasoned. Now the word reason has come in. Amtep reasoned, why should forces controlling the demon itself show concern for the little people on the island who had been doing their foolish rituals and human sacrifice? Who are doing sacrificing, why should the demon care about them? Demon is angry, right? He felt embarrassed by his own foolish thoughts at that time that the demon might be concerned by the mere patterns of his spot. He thought the demon was angry because he possibly didn't draw the bull god, sufficiently fearsome. Yet Amtep was still troubled by the question why. Why? What deep forces control the behavior of the world? And why do they sometimes burst forth in violent and seemingly incomprehensible ways? He shared his question with his grandson, but there was no answers. A century passed, and then a millennia. Still there were no answers. Amphos, the craftsman, had lived all his life in the small town as his father and his father's father before him and his father's 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 father before him. He made living constructing beautifully decorated gold bracelets, earrings, ceremonial cups, and other fine products of artistic skills. He was actually Amtep's generation, so that artistic skill is coming down the generation. Such work has been the family trade for some 40 generations. A line unbroken since Amtep had settled there 1100 years before. This is possibly around, this is a Greek civilization essentially. And so people had been wondering, people had been questioning about why suddenly such things happen on earth. But it was not just artistic skill that had passed down from generation to generation. Amtep's questions troubled Amphos just they had troubled Amtep earlier. The great story of the catastrophe that destroyed an ancient peaceful civilization had been handed down from father to son. Amtep's perception of the catastrophe had also survived with its descendants. Amphos too understood that heavens had a magnitude and stature so great as to be quite unconcerned by the terrible event. The heavens were not bothered by what happened that day and at that place, right? Nevertheless, the event had a catastrophic event on little people with their cities and their human sacrifices and their rituals. Thus, by comparison, the event itself must have been the result of enormous forces quite unconcerned by those trivial actions of human beings. Yet the nature of those forces was as unknown in Amphos's day as it was to Amtep. Amphos had studied the structure of plants, insects, and other small animals and crystalline rocks. His keen eye for observation had served him well in decorative design. So the term reason came earlier, word, and then comes observation. Reason and observation. These are the two aspects of scientific inquiry or mathematical inquiry. So for in mathematics, you need to have observation, you need to have reason, right? Logic, basically. He took great interest in agriculture and was fascinated by the growth of wheat and other plants from grain. So this is the time when agriculture had now started. But none of this told him why, and he felt unsatisfied. He believed that there was indeed reason underlying nature's patterns, but he was in no way equipped to unravel those reasons. One clear night, Amphos looked up at the heavens and tried to make out from the patterns of stars the shapes of those heroes and heroines who formed constellations in the sky. We know about various constellations, right? Like Shaptarshi is a constellation. Our Indian astronomers had named those constellations too. So we also have our own names. Same constellations, right? So constellation means a cluster of stars, and we can look at them and see there's fine kind of a design that might be there. One clear night, Amphos looked up at the heavens and tried to make out from the patterns of the stars the shapes of the heroes and heroines who formed constellations in the sky. To his humble artist's eye, those shapes made poor resemblances. He could himself have arranged the stars far more convincingly. He puzzled over why the gods had not organized the stars in a more appropriate way. As they were, the arrangement seemed to be more like scattered grains randomly sowed by a farmer rather than a deliberate design of a god. Then an odd thought overtook him. Do not seek for reason. Do not seek for reasons in the specific patterns of star or other scattered arrangements of objects. Look instead for a deeper universal order in the way that things behave. This is a very important leap in the thinking. Again, I am reading. Do not seek for reasons for specific patterns in stars or other scattered arrangements of objects. Look instead for a deeper universal order in the way things behave, and that's what science wants to uncover. Amphos reasoned that we find order after all, not in patterns that scattered seeds form when they fall in the ground, but in the miraculous way that each seed develops into a living plant having a superb structure similar in great detail to one another. We would not try to seek the meaning in the precise arrangement of seeds sprinkled on the soil, yet there must be meaning in the hidden mystery of the inner forces controlling each individual seeds, so that each one follows essentially the same wonderful course. Nature's laws must indeed have a superbly organized precision for that to be possible. So here that word has come, the laws of nature, right? Amphos became convinced that without precision in the underlying laws, there cannot be no order in the world, whereas much order is indeed perceived in the way things behave. Moreover, there must be precision in our ways of thinking about this matter if we are not to be led seriously astray. We also have to think about this matter in a very precise and organized way, which actually finally what we do today is called the scientific method, of which many of my viewers are actually students of science, so they would know it, what steps the scientific method takes. It so happened that the word had reached Amphos of a sage who lived in another part of the land and whose beliefs appeared to be in sympathy with those of Amphos. According to this sage, no one could rely on teachings and traditions of the past. To be certain of one's belief, it was necessary to form precise conclusion by the use of unchallengeable reason, that is, providing proofs, mathematical proofs. The nature of this precision had to be mathematical. That is why I am reading you this story. That mathematics finally comes. That ultimately this is the prestige of mathematics. The nature of this precision had to be mathematical, ultimately dependent on the notion of number and its application to geometric forms. Accordingly, it must be number and geometry and not myth and superstition that govern the behavior of the world. Accordingly, it must be, according to that sage that Amphos has heard about, accordingly, it must be number and geometry, not myth and superstition, that govern the behavior of the world. As Amtep had done a century and millennium before, Amphos took to the sea. He found his way to the city of Croton, where the sage and his brotherhood of 571 wise men and 28 wise women were in search of truth. After some time, Amphos was accepted into the brotherhood, and the name of that sage was Pythagoras. Isn't that beautiful? I want to read to